It's time now to bring in our Sunday group, the head of Heritage Action for America, Michael Needham, Marie Harf, a State Department official in the Obama administration, Jeff Mason, who covers the White House for Reuters, and former Republican Congressman Jason Chaffetz, who's now a Fox News contributor. Well, Congressman, let me start with you. Your reaction to what seems to be a dramatic escalation in North Korea's nuclear program. What they are saying is their first test of a hydrogen bomb.
It is an escalation, and we're going to have to ramp it up. And we've tried everything from sending in Dennis Rodman to boosting up the military presence. But I think a lot of focus has to go to Japan, on China. The secretary earlier in this program talked about new sanctions with anybody doing business with North Korea. Well, the main trading partner with North Korea is China, and it'll be very interesting to see how far this administration takes those types of sanctions. But China has the most vested interest in making that change there. But it's hard when more than $1 trillion of our United States debt is owned by the Chinese. That puts us in a very precarious position.
Yeah, Marie, I want to pick up on that with you as a veteran of the State Department. Your reaction to what has happened today in North Korea. And to be fair, your president and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton all tried, and they have all failed to stop North Korea from pursuing its nuclear ambitions.
That's right. And North Korea has shown that no amount of international isolation has dissuaded them from pursuing this program. So many administrations have tried. There are no perfect options. There aren't even really great ones. But two things I think are important. The president needs to be very clear that right now is not the time to renegotiate the South Korean trade agreement. Now is not the time to threaten them, because we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. We need to focus on the real threat here, which is North Korea. And to be fair, the South Korean trade agreement's a pretty good one. The president's tweet this morning about appeasement, when he basically said the South Korean government was wrong, that is breaking news already in Seoul this morning. We've already seen reaction out of there. This is the time to stand squarely with our allies, because as I've said, there are certainly no good military options. We have to make it clear to North Korea that if they do anything like attacking the U.S., that their regime will be destroyed. And I think the president has to walk a fine line in doing that.
And what do you think of the Secretary Mnuchin? And he had just gotten off the phone with President Trump, saying much tougher sanctions and much more targeted on China.
Absolutely. Sanctions have to be a key part of the strategy here, but they have to be combined with other things like making sure missile defense keeps getting better and better, making sure the South Koreans and the Japanese have what they need to defend themselves, and making clear to North Korea that this is not acceptable, and making sure the American people understand the real threat here, not an escalatory rhetoric cycle that we've seen before, but being very clear-eyed about it.
Michael, I want to bring you into the conversation. A bunch of things here to talk about. The North Korean test, the word from Secretary Mnuchin, a new sanctions regime, and also this question of, is this the right time to possibly pull out of our free trade agreement with South Korea?
Yeah, we need a full sanctions and pressure regime. We need ballistic missile defense. We need secondary sanctions on China if they're not willing to participate. The types of sanctions that were in place on Iran previous to President Obama's unadvised Iranian deal were far tougher than anything North Korea has been under. So the president isn't accurate when he's saying that North Korea is more isolated than any other country ever has been. I do agree now's not the right time to pull out of the Korea free trade agreement. That's an important free trade agreement. It benefits farmers and ranchers across America. But the same is also true of South Korea. South Korean President Moon has talked about restarting the Kaesong industrial complex. This was a joint South Korea-North Korea industrial complex that was started about 20 years ago. It was the expansion of it was stopped in 2006 after the nuclear test. It was pulled out of in 2016. I think if America and Korea are going to stand side by side, we should stay in our free trade agreement. But I think it would be a big disaster also for South Korea to reopen the Kaesong industrial complex.
Jeff, I want to a certain degree, this all feels like Groundhog Day to me, that the clock is waking up at, is ringing at 6 in the morning, and I'm hearing, I got you, babe, again. How many times have we seen it? There's a North Korean missile test or a nuclear test. We huff and puff. We talk about military options. We talk about sanctions. We talk about pressure in China. You've been covering the White House now for, 9 years? Everybody back to Bill Clinton has tried it. Never works.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Bill Clinton actually, during his presidency, agreed on a package of giving $4 billion in energy aid to North Korea. That ended up not happening. President Obama asked his military to work together with South Korea to prepare for a potential attack. George W. Bush called North Korea the axis of evil, or part of the axis of evil. So you've heard rhetoric like this, you've heard words from presidents, and now, of course, you have President Trump really raising his rhetoric up in terms of talking about fire and fury. The question is, will any of that matter, and where is it going?
And what's the answer?
Well, the answer is we have to see what happens with North Korea and see what happens with China. President Trump has certainly worked very hard to build a relationship with President Xi of China, but he's shown increasing frustration with the fact that that relationship is not paying off. And, you know, as they're deciding whether or not to put more sanctions and economic pressure on China, as Secretary Mnuchin said, you have to also wonder if that's going to alienate a very key partner.
But I don't think sanctions would ever work. I don't think the president of North Korea cares about his people. He is only focused on obtaining nuclear capability.
Let me interrupt for a second, Congressman, because we've been talking around this. The one thing we really haven't discussed is a military option. Is there a realistic, credible military option?
I hope we never get to that point, but I do think the focus of the world has got to be with China, because North Korea's trading partner is China. And if China is not going to live up to the obligation to help what they did under the UN, I mean, I was very pleased with what Nikki Haley and the UN was able to achieve. But China has really got to be the focus here.
But the cost of even a perfect first military strike, the cost of that would be so appalling in terms of casualties, not just in South Korea and Japan, but possibly to American service members who are still serving over there. The cost of a military option would be astronomical, none of which I think we've thought through.
All right, we have to take a break here. But when we come back, the president is set to announce his decision for DACA this week. What will happen to the hundreds of thousands of dreamers in the U.S.? Plus, what would you like to ask the panel about President Trump's response to Harvey? Just go to Facebook or Twitter at Fox News Sunday, and we may use your question on the air.
What are you building?
President Trump meeting yesterday with victims of the destruction left by Harvey in his second trip to Texas this week. And we're back now with the panel. Well, we ask you 4 questions for our Sunday group. And on the issue of the president's response to Harvey, we got this on Facebook from Paige Williams. She writes, what are the differences between how Trump responded to Harvey versus past presidents and their biggest disaster? Jeff, how do you answer, Paige?
Well, the president got some criticism, rightly or wrongly, on Tuesday for not showing enough empathy. But when he went on Tuesday to Texas, he didn't go into the middle, really, of the disaster zone because it was still being worked on. There was still a lot of response going. So what he did yesterday was meet with some of the victims, do some of those things that presidents do and help put some aid into trucks at a church. It's comparable, but there will be people who say it's not the same.
But forget the presidential optics for a moment, because in the end it doesn't matter very much. In terms of FEMA, in terms of aid on the ground, what's your sense of how the federal response is going?
So far, it seems like the federal response has been very positive. I mean, there's been very little criticism coming from the state where it's actually affecting, or which has actually been affected. You had Governor Abbott on your program earlier. He's been very complimentary. Unlike Katrina, where clearly aid wasn't getting there fast enough, this response appears to have been very rapid.
Also, we have to say, because the first responders are the state and the local government,
correct,
Texas seems to have done a much better job than New Orleans and Louisiana did.
Absolutely.
Michael, I have a feeling I'm going to get to a negative point right now, because the news that Secretary Mnuchin made earlier in the program is he said, we want any disaster aid, and they're talking about $8 billion this week, linked to a clean debt limit bill, because we're not going to be able to provide all that disaster aid, billions of dollars, unless we have raised the debt limit. Your reaction to that?
Yeah, I didn't really understand why he thinks the two things need to be linked. Everybody agrees that we should get the $15 billion of real emergency relief that's necessary out to Texas. I talked to Mark Meadows yesterday.
Chairman of the House Freedom Caucus.
Chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. Conservatives in the House are tied to that. I think that exploiting this hurricane and people who lost their houses to allow business as usual in Washington of getting an 18-month increase to our nation's debt limit, past of continuing to spend money that we can't afford, that we don't have, makes absolutely no sense. If there's some sort of technical reason that in order to get $15 billion out, a very, very small couple $1 billion increase of the debt limit is necessary, then of course nobody would have that. But I just completely disagree with Secretary Mnuchin that in order to deliver relief to the people of Houston, to the people of Texas, and Louisiana, which we obviously want to do, that an 18-month increase of our nation's debt limit is necessary. It makes absolutely no sense.
But he clearly was pushing that line today, and he a couple of times invoked President Trump to make it clear that the president wants a clean debt limit tied to disaster relief. You say you've been talking to the head of the House Freedom Caucus. Will they oppose that?
You know, I think they will, first of all. If there's a clean debt limit increase, it doesn't matter what it's attached to. You have to go back to kind of first principles. Why is it that 100 years ago, America voluntarily decided to put a debt limit on ourselves? And we said it makes sense to have a smoke alarm in our fiscal house. And when that smoke alarm goes off, everyone agrees we need to raise the debt limit. But you should also start taking the types of steps that are necessary to make sure that our children and grandchildren don't suffer under debts that they can't afford to pay.
Well, not only is that going to be a big issue here in Washington this week, what's going to happen with disaster relief? Another big issue is the president is going to announce his decision on DACA. During the campaign, candidate Trump promised to end the DACA program, which protects hundreds of thousands of so-called dreamers from deportation. But as president, he's made it clear he is struggling with this. Take a look.
DACA is a very, very difficult subject for me, I will tell you. To me, it's one of the most difficult subjects I have, because you have these incredible kids. They shouldn't be very worried. They are here illegally. They shouldn't be very worried. I do have a big heart.
Now, Congressman Chaffetz, the president has said he is going to announce what he's going to do on DACA on Tuesday, which is also the day that 10 states are saying that they are going to file suit against the government because they claim DACA as an executive order is unconstitutional. But a lot of Republicans, starting with your own former House Speaker, he's still the House Speaker, but you're a former Congressman, Paul Ryan, says that he shouldn't end DACA. Is Ryan and are those other Republicans wrong?
Well, the president has a mandate based on the election to lock down that border, get rid of the rewards and incentives to be here illegally, and reject amnesty. I do think the president, based on my conversations with people on the Hill the last 48 hours or so, I think what the president's going to do is give a window of opportunity for Congress to actually do something on immigration reform over a 6-month period. That's my best guess as to what's going to happen. I don't think you'll see him clearly just cut it off the very next day, later this week. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think the president does have a big heart, and it is difficult to deal with somebody who was brought here as a 2-year-old. Mm-hmm. But the president also campaigned on the idea that we're not going to provide rewards and incentives. I do think it'll be an impetus to get Luis Gutierrez and other members on the Democratic side of the aisle to the table to know that they're going to have to actually work in a bipartisan way to try to achieve some of the things that the president has gotten elected on.
So let me make sure I understand what you're suggesting. Say that we're going to end DACA, but give a 6-month window for Congress to do something. And, of course, the obvious question then is, would funding for the border wall be part of that deal?
Well, again, they have to get the funding for the border wall. It's a modest amount. It's less than $2 billion out of a $4 trillion budget. I do think the president will get that money, but I also think you'll see a continuing resolution that will punt some of these really tough decisions down to later in December. I don't think
let's ruin our Christmas and New Year's. Let's do that.
Yes.
Marie, I want to bring you in because, look, people can disagree with the merits of protecting the dreamers, whether it creates an incentive, whether it's amnesty. On the other hand, there certainly is a legitimate argument that President Obama acted illegally, unconstitutionally in doing this by executive order, and it should be better done by Congress.
Well, and the courts, I think, are going to they have been looking at it, and they will continue to. I get nervous relying on Congress right now to fix anything because they've shown themselves incapable of being able to pass anything major, even though they control both the House, the Senate, and the White House. Look, there are 141,000 DACA recipients just in Texas, to bring together Harvey and Texas for a second. These are people, we've seen stories. There's a Houston area paramedic who's been saving lives of people, who is a DACA recipient. Getting rid of this without a plan to replace it, as the congressman talked about, Congress, may fix it, seems to me to just quite frankly be mean. And I hate to use that word, but it seems mean. It also was bad economics. You asked Secretary Mnuchin about that during your interview with him, and he kind of wavered on that because there are studies that say if you kick out all these people, we will lose billions and billions of dollars in revenue.
But if the Democrats thought this was such an imperative when they had the House and Senate and the presidency, guess what? They didn't do anything with it.
That was a long time ago.
President Obama didn't do anything
memory.
of this until a few months before a presidential election. That's the reality of it.
Well, let's all put our hopes in Congress to actually get something done.
There's a reason that businesses are pushing the president not to do this. I mean, there is definitely an economic piece to this that the president is clearly considering, and that businesses and Republicans and Democrats are as well.
15 seconds. How would you feel if he did what Congressman Chaffetz is suggesting? I'm going to stop DACA, but I'll give you 6 months to fix it.
We need an immigration policy that makes sense for over 320 million Americans, not for small segments of sympathetic groups.
Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.